Oke.
Di aku udah 12.
Oke, kita mulai ya. Ini teman-teman sudah pada menunggu. Baik, selamat siang kepada para sahabat Pusdema dan juga kepada para pemirsa di YouTube yang kami hormati dan kami cintai. Selamat siang waktu Indonesia, selamat sore waktu Australia, mungkin selamat malam waktu untuk teman-teman yang di Amerika Serikat, dan juga selamat pagi-pagi sekali untuk teman-teman yang berada di Eropa. Selamat bergabung dengan acara kami dari Pusdema Universitas Sanata Dharma di Yogyakarta, di Indonesia pada kesempatan ini. Nah, teman-teman yang saya hormati, saya cintai, hari ini kita berjumpa lagi dalam acara rutin Pusdema, dan pada hari ini kita akan mengadakan acara bincang siang, karena di Jogja sekarang ini sedang jam 1 siang, tanggal 29 hari Rabu, tanggal 29 September tahun 2021. Kami senang sekali bisa menyelenggarakan acara ini untuk teman-teman. Dan pada periode 1 jam ke depan kita akan mendapat kehormatan seorang tamu, yaitu Dr. Poulgrain dari Australia, khususnya dari Sunshine Coast University di dekat Brisbane di Australia. Selamat datang Pak Greg, welcome Pak Greg.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here, even though only virtually. Nah, teman-teman dan kerabat sahabat Pusdema semua yang saya hormati, kebetulan Pak Greg ini dari Australia dan beliau tidak terlalu confident kalau ngomong dengan bahasa Indonesia karena topiknya cukup serius. Maka nanti acara ini akan kami selenggarakan dalam bahasa Inggris, tentu dengan variasi bahasa Indonesia untuk kita. Nah, sekali lagi kita akan membahas buku sebagaimana yang kami sampaikan di dalam poster kami, yaitu buku yang ditulis oleh Dr. Poulgrain yang sekarang ada di hadapan kita semua, yang judulnya adalah JFK versus DULES, Battleground Indonesia. Buku ini sangat menarik, berkisah mengenai persaingan antara John F. Kennedy dengan Direktur CIA DULES, tetapi dengan fokus masalah Indonesia. Baik, untuk tidak berlama-lama, saya akan sedikit membacakan siapa itu Dr. Poulgrain. Nanti bisa kita lihat sendiri secara detail karena ini akan ada di YouTube. Ya, ini adalah buku beliau, judulnya JFK versus DULES, Battleground Indonesia. Dr. Poulgrain, Dr. Poulgrain's academic career started with a BA at University of Queensland di Brisbane, with only 1 unit of history and a double major in literature. This was soon followed by honors first class. Wah, luar biasa ini. Honors first class in history at James Cook University, Townsville, with supervision by Professor Bob Herring, yang tentu kita sebagai orang Indonesia sering dengar nama beliau. He was awarded a PhD in 1994 for his work on confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia. Jadi ini masalah konfrontasi Indonesia-Malaysia. One of the examiners, Professor Ian Louvier dari Amsterdam, yang juga sangat terkenal untuk kalangan akademisi di Indonesia, khususnya sejarah dan ilmu sosial lain, said the dissertation would place Poulgrain in the front rank of Southeast Asian scholars. Ya, ini luar biasa dan kita sudah bertemu dalam tanda kutip dengan Dr. Poulgrain ini in the front rank of Southeast Asian scholars. The dissertation was later published as The Genesis of Konfrontasi, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, 1945-1965. Documents from the London archives on British decolonization in Malaysia showed how Indonesian pressure led to the British decision in 1957 to grant Malayan independence. Jadi Malaya menjadi merdeka antara lain karena tekanan dari Indonesia terhadap pemerintah di London. And also showed how British intelligence worked at continuing to exert influence in Brunei and Singapore once Malaysia was formed in 1963. It also reveals that in the machinations leading to konfrontasi, Soekarno was incorrectly blamed as instigator. Jadi menurut Pak Greg ini konfrontasi itu inisiatornya atau yang memulai itu bukan Bung Karno. Ini berdasarkan riset yang beliau lakukan. This research brought to light a serious contradiction between the actions of the U.S. Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, yaitu Allen Dulles, and the policy of the new U.S. President, yaitu Presiden Kennedy. And from this came further extensive research, which led to the follow-up book, dan itu judulnya adalah JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia, sebagaimana yang sudah saya sebutkan tadi. Begitu kira-kira sedikit latar belakang dari narasumber kita pada hari ini, yaitu Dr. Greg Poulgrain. Sekarang saya akan dalam waktu kira-kira 1 jam ke depan, saya ingin menyampaikan beberapa pertanyaan informal kepada Dr. Greg Poulgrain. Dan kalau teman-teman ada pertanyaan atau apa, silahkan ditulis di box chat di YouTube. Okay, Pak Greg, now I can talk to you after talking to our friends and colleagues and audience in YouTube. Okay, well, I have read your biodata. I just finished it, but can you? That was what written there. Can you, or do you have anything to add from what I just read?
Well, from my initial interest in literature, in the biodata, rather than history and politics, I thought, well, that's probably why I met Dr. Lubis and Pramudia Anantatur together, the two remarkable Indonesian writers who'd not always seen eye to eye. In literature, I was interested in Hemingway, and I decided to visit the very place where he'd written The Old Man and the Sea. So to get to Singapore, my first destination, I travelled east-west through Indonesia in 1978, starting with 2 weeks on the Tampamas 1. This was replaced later by Tampamas 2, which was the one that had the maritime disaster. I wrote as I travelled, so by the time I reached the Netherlands, I'd acquired enough Indonesia perspective for a Dutch professor there to ask me to do a PhD. In retrospect, I'm horrified to say now that my reply was that I was too busy.
Too busy traveling.
In London, 1986, Zulkifli Lubis, whom I'd met in Jakarta in 1983, asked me back to Jakarta to do some research, but I'd contracted typhoid fever and decided to return to Australia. So I then started my doctorate there 10 years after the initial request by the Dutch professor. So it's a bit of extension to my biodata there to fill in some details. Yes.
Okay, go ahead. So the first time you set foot in Indonesia was in 78?
78, yes.
Oh, okay,
yes.
Okay.
And that was when I travelled on the Tampamas. It was an interesting trip, very interesting. Mm.
Yes. You said you also wanted to visit the place where Hemingway was writing The Old Man and the Sea. And where was that?
10 kilometers outside Havana.
10 kilometers outside Havana.
So yeah, I didn't seem daunted by anything in my youth, so I went there. In fact, I got a visa in London, and still unaware really of the difficulties of travelling to a place like Cuba. I had no real conception of the political problems. But when I approached the ambassador for the visa, he told me, "You're the first to apply." And I wasn't aware that there were restrictions.
Wow.
And he said that all the rules had just been changed last week, and I'm the first person to apply. And he celebrated with 3 Havana Club runs, so it's the best visa I've ever got, really. It was pure coincidence that I'd gone in to get a visa at that time. So remarkable, yeah. But I did meet the family that Hemingway was with. I met them and stayed with them for a month. And
for a month, huh?
Yeah, amazing experience, really, yeah. Right on the beach. And they had photographs around the room of Hemingway, and I think Hemingway gave his fishing line to the son in the family, so things like that. But it was really a remarkable trip, and I was quite amazed in later years that I'd done such a thing.
Yes, and perhaps next time you have more time to write, probably you should write your first trip to Indonesia and Tampomas,
yes.
And also visit to the house where Hemingway was writing that very famous piece of literature. Okay, but the book that you just published last year, which is the focus of our discussion today, is called JFK versus Allen Dulles. Can you share with us the main points of the book, or the argument that you want to present through that book?
Yes, I'd probably list a few main points from the book. Allen Dulles was Director of Central Intelligence under Kennedy in 1961. He was removed in November that year. Kennedy ushered him out, forced him to resign that year, replaced him as DCI with somebody else. But he actually did not relinquish his power. He kept his office, his old office in Washington, and did not work in the new CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. Even though he designed the building, he didn't go there to work. Kennedy blamed Allen Dulles for the Bay of Pigs catastrophe, which in political terms for Kennedy was the biggest defeat of his career, according to Sorensen, his speechwriter. Because of that debacle in Cuba, JFK ushered Dulles out. And he did a month or so after the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, UN Secretary General, killed in the plane crash in the Congo, September 1961. So this book, second point would be, this book accuses Allen Dulles of involvement in the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, to start with. Bishop Tutu produced intelligence documents in which Allen Dulles was saying Dag Hammarskjöld had to be eliminated. But all investigations into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld have looked no further than Cuba, where the death occurred. This book is saying Allen Dulles really is using, or was using, the same group that he used to kill Patrice Lumumba. US Senate investigation 1975 found him responsible for the death of Lumumba. The same group to kill Lumumba was used to kill Dag Hammarskjöld. But Allen Dulles had reasons for this which were centred on Southeast Asia, not on Cuba. And once the investigation, UN investigation, current UN investigation now, looks into this, I think further, they'll find the details, further details. It's not really taking into consideration the motive of Allen Dulles fully. So he was wanting to stop a UN intervention in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in the Netherlands and Guinea. It was clear that Allen Dulles used the interest of the Congo as a cover for his nefarious activities elsewhere. The third point would be the book combines archival research with interviews, sometimes involving one and the same person. For example, Jean-Jacques Duzzy was interviewed, the man who discovered gold in West New Guinea, Netherlands, New Guinea in 1936. Dulles had set up the company that Duzzy was in. It was the Rockefeller Company. The gold deposit was the largest primary deposit in the world and has influenced really the political fate of Indonesia from that date of discovery. Had Dulles not gone ahead and taken steps to eliminate Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary-General would have proceeded with a plan to use the UN to intervene in the Dutch-Indonesia sovereignty dispute of the territory, and was on the point of granting Papuan people their independence, apparently. AD did not want this to happen and covered his tracks only as a master Cold War strategist could. He left JFK no choice but to hand over the territory to President Sukarno. But the thing I've shown in the book is that Alan Dulles, at the same time as handing it over to Sukarno, was planning to replace Sukarno as president. Very devious. Sukarno would not have given the foreign company the free rein that Suharto gave Freeport Indonesia. They still have 100% control of operating the mine, and even though the majority shares are now in the hands of the Indonesian government. So DH, that is Dag Hammarskjöld, almost upset the apple cart. Fourth point would be the Dutch presence in New Guinea came from both the PKI and the army. They were both putting up strong arguments that the Dutch should leave. The two former foreign ministers, Sunario and Ruslan Abdul Ghani, told me that US funds were helping to stoke the fires of opposition to Dutch colonial rule in Netherlands, New Guinea. This US assistance helped to balance the PKI opposition to Dutch colonialism. But before 1958, the Indonesian army did not have a strong central command. Dulles intervened in 1958. This is quite a major part of the book. It's chapter 4, I think. And the CIA intervention that he got together became known as the Outer Islands Rebellion, or the PRRI. You only have to read the book by Ambassador Allison, US Ambassador Allison, that's before Jones, who was in Jakarta in 1957, to see how hard Alan Dulles worked to discredit Allison in order to get the PRRI to proceed. This strong centralised army command was needed in 1962 to kick out the Dutch, and later on needed to oust Sukarno himself. The book also shows in final chapter the tragedy, I suppose, that occurred in 65, 66. Most of the PKI were landless rice farmers, which is why Sukarno called the PKI radical nationalists. But I should add, even the head man at the Indonesia desk in London, Derek Tonkin, disagreed with the description of the PKI as communist, strangely enough. He said if the PKI ever came to power in Indonesia, they would be more nationalist than communist. Surprisingly, 6 months ago, Tonkin, he must be about 95 years old now, contacted me on email.
Wow.
Yes.
He's still
an elderly gentleman. Yes, yes. Saying a few interesting things. JFK's massive US aid program ran into trouble with the US Congress. This leads up to the gist of the story, because Indonesia and Malaysia were politically bickering and fighting armed skirmishes along the Sarawak border, confrontation. The US Congress stopped US aid. Kennedy and Sukarno jointly decided that if Kennedy went to Jakarta, he'd be able to stop confrontasi. And Dean Rusk confirmed this in writing for me. And what I'm saying in the book is that this is why Alan Dulles decided Kennedy's trip had to be stopped. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, he got on side by bringing into the argument the Cold War issue of Sino-Soviet dispute, and that was really how Kennedy fell foul of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. After this book is saying that Kennedy's Indonesia strategy, pro-Sukarno approach, threatened Alan Dulles' Cold War games in Indonesia. Dulles wanted Sukarno out, and the Sino-Soviet rift would not have erupted as it did after 65-66 without the cataclysmic changes that occurred in Indonesia. So that's really a point of history that needs to be emphasised, I think, the Sino-Soviet rift and the link it had with Indonesia, which not many people are aware of yet, but I hope it can be discussed further. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Greg, for 5 or 6 important points. So let me try to say something before I ask further question to you. Let me underline these important points to my Indonesian colleagues. So please allow me to say it in bahasa Indonesia.
Yes.
Oke, teman-teman sekalian, menarik apa yang dikatakan Pak Greg ini, yaitu bahwa dalam penelitian beliau yang selama berpuluh tahun itu menemukan beberapa hal yang ya mungkin kita setuju atau mungkin kita tidak, tetapi itu yang ditemukan oleh Pak Greg, dan mungkin ini bisa menjadi informasi tambahan bagi kita untuk melihat sejarah Indonesia pasca proklamasi. Nah, apa yang baru saya kira yang dari Pak Greg ini akan saya sebutkan 5 atau 6 poin berikut yang tadi sudah disampaikan. Tetapi saya kira yang menarik dari Pak Greg ini secara umum adalah kesadaran kita bahwa sejarah nasional internal kita ini ternyata punya kaitan yang sangat erat dengan apa yang bergerak di luar Indonesia. So the 6 points, or 5 or 6 points that I may underline here. Nomor 1 adalah bahwa ya betul bulan November 63 itu Alan Dulles atau Alan Dulles dikatakan Pak Greg tadi memang sudah dipecat sebagai direktur CIA, tetapi ternyata beliau masih aktif, masih ngantor di Pentagon dan di Langley dan sebagainya. Lalu Pak Greg juga menunjukkan adanya kaitan antara kecelakaan pesawat yang dialami oleh Dag Hammarskjöld, waktu itu Sekretaris Jenderal PBB, dengan kepentingan Dulles, ya, atau Alan Dulles ini. Karena Alan Dulles tidak ingin bahwa proses dekolonisasi termasuk di Papua itu nanti dilaksanakan, maka dia harus di stop, kata Pak Greg. Lalu ya Dag Hammarskjöld akhirnya mengalami kecelakaan pesawat, dan ternyata tim yang terlibat di situ antaranya juga terlibat dengan pembunuhan Patrice Lumumba dari Kongo. Itu poin kedua. Poin yang ketiga tentu Pak Greg juga menyinggung soal penemuan tambang emas di Papua oleh Jinjok Dosi dan kawan-kawan, Wiesel dan Colline, 3 orang waktu itu, tahun 1936. Dan ternyata di situ Alan Dulles juga main. Lalu Pak Greg menyebutnya sebagai Master Cold War Warrior ini, yang punya kepentingan di situ. Lalu juga itu poin yang ketiga. Poin keempat saya kira ini ya, Dulles juga ikut berusaha bagaimana supaya militer Indonesia yang waktu itu sampai tahun 50 itu belum solid itu menjadi solid, antara lain dengan adanya PRI Permesta dan sebagainya. Dan juga ada waktu itu ada duta besar Amerika yang sangat simpatik kepada Bung Karno dan Indonesia, namanya Ellison. What's his full name?
Ellison.
John M. Ellison. Yeah. And
Ambassador from the Prairie.
Yeah, or the other name for the book was Ellison Wonderland.
Yes.
Ellison Wonderland, or Ambassador from the Prairie. I think he was originally from one of the Dakotas. I don't know, from the prairie area. Yeah, itu jadi
Nebraska, was it? I forget.
Yeah, somewhere in the Midwest. Oke, dan Ellison ini karena sangat pro Indonesia, pro Soekarno dan sebagainya, akhirnya mendapat tekanan dari Ellen Dulles ini, sehingga dia hanya berkarya di sini selama 11 bulan, lalu dikirim. I think he was sent to Czechoslovakia when Czech Republic and Slovakia were still one country. Ya, itu poin keempat. Lalu poin kelima, ya ternyata Dulles juga punya kaitan dengan apa yang terjadi di Indonesia tahun 65-66, yaitu ya karena dia punya tujuan tertentu di Indonesia, misalnya terkait dengan tambang emas di Papua dan sebagainya. Itu menurut Pak Greg ya. Maka Dulles itu berkepentingan juga untuk menggagalkan rencana JFK untuk berkunjung ke Indonesia. Waktu itu Presiden JFK sudah berencana untuk berkunjung ke Indonesia awal tahun 64, tapi sebelum itu terjadi tanggal 22 November tahun 63 JFK itu dibunuh di Dallas di Texas. Nah, juga menarik bahwa menurut penemuan hasil penelitian Pak Greg ini ada kaitan juga situasi di Indonesia tahun 65 itu dengan perseteruan atau perpecahan antara Moskow dengan Beijing, antara Uni Soviet dengan RRT waktu itu. Ya, di sini juga Dulles ikut bermain menurut penelitian Pak Greg Poulgrain ini. Jadi itu beberapa poin yang saya kira penting, ada 6 poin yang mungkin perlu kita perdalam, dan kalau kita tertarik atau Anda tertarik, panjenengan tertarik, silahkan membaca bukunya Pak Greg ini. Okay, Greg, that was my trying to underline several points I think very important. There is something interesting I thought on page 307, especially footnote number 361. You mentioned something about 2 Americans, 1 woman, 1 man who were in Central Java when the massacre was taking place. Can you tell us more about it and your source and things like that?
There were three sources there: Bertrand Russell, Marshall Green, and Margaret Lyon. The location was Klaten, Central Java, former stronghold of the PKI. Now, Bertrand Russell participated in a seminar in the US and published a paper in 1968 in which he stated that, on good authority, because he was quite a famous man at the time, and with high connections, he reported that some ships from the 7th Fleet, for some mysterious reason, were moored off the coast of Java in 1966, and no one could figure out what was happening, why they were there. The question was asked what they were doing, why they were there, what they were up to, and there was no answer. Now, the second point was Green. From a declassified telegram, Green contacted the political advisor to the commander of the 7th Fleet on October the 23rd, 1965, asking for covert assistance with some travel. He wanted travel. He didn't say helicopter, and we tend to think of it as trucks because there were some trucks given, but possibly a helicopter. Now, I say helicopter because the third source, Lyon, was an American research student at the time. She visited the area. She visited Klaten a few years after the events in 66 and was informed by 2 persons in Klaten that a man and a woman who were Americans had been working together with the army. They pointed out the room. They called it the operation room, where the Americans used to come in every day, and apparently by helicopter. Then they'd help the army up in this room, and the procedures that were happening in this operation room were going ahead with arresting and killing local people from the PKI. This was an area where a lot of killing occurred. The helicopter was reported nearby, but still, they didn't understand where the helicopter came from or where it went to, so there was a lot of mystery about this helicopter. But when you put the three sources together, it's quite possible that the helicopter came from offshore on one of the ships. There's nowhere else for it to go. Mm. And they were bringing the two persons every day. They'd go back, they'd sleep on the boat at night. I calculated 23 minutes it would take by helicopter from the boat to the place where the helicopter was in Klaten. So it's, I think the only way that could be proved eventually will be American researchers will have to look into US Navy records to confirm this. But I think Peter Dale Scott was saying there were more than a dozen persons like this man and a woman who had been brought over, and these were just two operating at the time. So what the others were doing, where they went, I don't know, but there were two persons, man and a woman in Klaten in 66, helping the Indonesian army do what they did, which is tragic in many ways, because this goes against everything that the people like US Ambassador Marshall Green has said, that everything that happened in 65, 66 was completely by surprise, and we had no role in whatever took place, because that was proven wrong later on, because he used to meet secretly with Adam Malik to convey messages secretly to Suharto, General Suharto, and that's how Suharto and Marshall Green were keeping in contact, through surreptitious nighttime meetings with Adam Malik, who then relayed the information and the questions, the communication with Marshall Green and Suharto. In one point, in an interview many, many years later, Marshall Green admitted that when he and Suharto were together at a public meeting and they sort of recognised each other, they'd never actually talked, but from the other side of the room, he used to wink to say, I see you, you see me. He winked. That's as close as their public communication was. But Marshall Green said that in an interview years later. But he didn't want to be seen public meeting Suharto, because that would give the game away, that somehow US were helping Suharto behind the scenes or something, and it would reduce the whole effect that what was happening in 65, 66 as a means of splitting Moscow and Beijing. He didn't want Marshall Green, US Ambassador Marshall Green, did not want the Soviet or the Chinese embassy or they left, but he didn't want them to see that there was some physical connection between the two, because they might get suspicious. But there was no physical communication seen. So it's really an interesting interview that Marshall Green gave years and years later, saying he was getting worried that everything he'd done in the 60s had still not been publicly recognised, acknowledged, because it really led to the split between Moscow and Beijing. So when President Nixon and Kissinger went to visit Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in 1972, Marshall Green was with them. Mm. And the assistant or the aide for Kissinger told US media later on that this whole meeting between Mao Zedong and President Nixon, we can attribute to the work done by Green, back in Indonesia years before, which is amazing, because nobody seems to have yet made that link.
The link between
what happened in Indonesia and the split between Moscow and Peking.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay.
I mentioned that interview I had with Adam Malik many years ago, 1983, which really I was more surprised than anybody, I suppose, because he began talking about this, and I was wondering why he was being. So I didn't ask the question. I didn't know anything about it, but he brought it up, and he felt, I think a bit. Well, he was dying of cancer, and he had less than 1 year to live, and he wanted to make a clean break, clean breast, clear his conscience a bit, and he began speaking quite openly about this. And sitting next to him was Adi Yatman,
Adi Atman,
his adjutant. And Adi Atman got concerned that Adam Malik was speaking so frankly, and he said, "Please, don't say so much to Greg, blah, blah, blah." But I think Adam Malik was a bit more relaxed because, well, first of all, he was concerned, he was dying. But Nishijima, who was a close friend of Adam Malik in Tokyo, I've spoken to, and Nishijima arranged the interview for me with Adam Malik. Nishijima had given me the go-ahead to see him. So I think Adam Malik, in that respect, was prepared to speak openly, and he did. And he brought my attention for the first time ever to the role of the Sino-Soviet split in what happened in Indonesia in 65, 66, 67. And it led on to Nixon's visit in 1972.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Pak Greg. Teman-teman, ada dua hal yang ingin saya garis bawahi dari yang disampaikan Pak Greg ini. Tetapi sebelum itu saya ingin menyapa teman-teman saya ini yang muncul di sini. Ada Romo Franz Susilo SY. He is a Jesuit, Greg. I live in the same community with him, and he says hello to you, Father Susilo. He used to be the head of our library here at Sanata Dharma University. And also present with us here are Dr. Yosef Yapitaum, the Vice Chairman of Pusdema, and also Professor Novita Dewi.
Yes, thank you.
They are all here with us. And Professor Novita Dewi even mentioned that according to Pramudyananda Tur, he is not just a nationalist, he is an ultra-nationalist. He loved this country so much.
Yes.
Oke, teman-teman, ada dua hal yang mungkin perlu kita garis bawahi dari yang disampaikan oleh Pak Greg. Ini saya bahasa Indonesia karena beberapa yang ikut itu mungkin teman-teman mahasiswa saya di S1 itu yang bahasa Inggrisnya masih bahasa Inggris perjuangan. Oke, salah satu dikatakan di dalam bukunya Pak Greg halaman 307 bahwa berdasarkan sumber yang dia dapat dari Bertrand Russell, lalu Marshall Green, itu duta besar Amerika untuk Indonesia, dan juga Margaret, what's her last name? Lyon?
Lyon.
Yeah,
Lyon.
Lyon.
Yeah, Lyon, yeah.
Lyon, yeah. Margaret.
Sociologist, yeah.
Sociologist, huh?
Yeah.
Did I meet her also in Canberra when you were there?
I think you did. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And I said to someone that she was not happy when I presented something connecting what happened in Indonesia with things outside Indonesia. And she said to me, I think it's about time for Indonesians not to blame others, but to see history from their own perspective internally, something like that. Anyway, tapi teman-teman, menurut Pak Greg, ini menurut tiga sumber itu, Pak Greg melihat bahwa ketika sedang terjadi kekerasan massal, pemantauan massal di Klaten, itu ada dua orang Amerika, seorang laki-laki dan seorang perempuan yang bolak-balik datang ke Klaten naik helikopter. Nah, tampaknya helikopter ini setelah ngedrop di Klaten balik ke Samudra Hindia karena di sana ada kapal dari armada ke-7 Amerika Serikat yang diparkir di sana. Lalu ada helikopter yang bolak-balik itu. Nah, siapa orang Amerika dan apa kerjaannya waktu itu masih harus dicari lebih lanjut. Tetapi saya kira ini, kalau ini memang betul, ini menunjukkan bahwa ya ada keterlibatan asing di dalam peristiwa yang terjadi pada tahun 65 itu. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua yang juga masih merupakan bahan riset lebih lanjut, nanti teman-teman yang lebih muda mungkin bisa melanjutkan, yaitu kaitan antara apa yang terjadi di Indonesia pada tahun 65-66 itu dengan persaingan antara Moskow dengan Beijing, antara Uni Soviet dengan Republik Rakyat Tiongkok. Nah, apa yang terjadi di Indonesia menurut Pak Greg itu bagian dari persaingan di antara mereka itu yang nanti semakin banyak korbannya, semakin bisa menyalahkan pihak lain dan sebagainya. Yang jelas sejak apa yang terjadi di Indonesia pada waktu itu memang Soviet dan Tiongkok itu pecah kongsi sampai hari ini. Baik, itu yang saya kira dua hal yang bisa kita garis bawahi dari apa yang dikatakan Pak Greg. Something a little bit maybe outside your book, Pak Greg. It was a fact that before becoming a president, JFK or Kennedy came to Indonesia to visit Indonesia and probably met some officials here. Do you have any comments, or would it be a factor in which Kennedy had some kind of emotional closeness to Indonesia and also to President Sukarno?
Well, he had a good understanding of, I think, the decline of colonialism in that time, because the countries that he visited in the early 50s, well, he went right around the world, and including Indonesia. Mm-hmm. But later on, when he became a senator, he spoke out very strongly against the continuation of colonial, or the decline of colonial rule, with Algeria, of course, as the main example. Vietnam he visited early as well, and he had a good understanding of the situation in Vietnam, and that probably led him to be disinclined to become further involved. And as you know, he was in the process of withdrawing in 1963 when he was assassinated. And I think some people have linked the two, but as you know, when one compares the significance or the size of Vietnam as alongside Indonesia, Indonesia's by far the largest country in Southeast Asia. And Americans at that time, in the late 50s, early 60s, placed far more significance on Indonesia than they had to do with Vietnam or any other country in Southeast Asia. So whether you talk about domino theory or whatever, it's just the actual wealth of Indonesia that attracted American attention, in particular Rockefeller companies linked with Rockefeller had very close attention with Indonesia. And Kennedy was, when he became president, was really in a clash with interests like that, because he couldn't carry out what he wanted to do politically, in political terms, with Sukarno, because of the interference he was getting from multinational companies, or big American companies. So yes, his early contact with Indonesia was crucial, and it seemed to instill in him a sense of this is the decline of colonial era, and the proper thing to do is to acknowledge the rise of the new powers such as Sukarno. And the other reason he liked Sukarno, of course, particularly after Sukarno visited Washington, was he was a nationalist. Mm-hmm. And DULES insisted on calling him a communist purely because it was for personal motives, I think. He wanted to be able to brand Sukarno as the president he did not want, and he started it way back in 1955 after the Bandung Conference to plan to remove him. Mm-hmm. And I think there were 7 assassination attempts. DULES tried 7 on Sukarno, and I remember when reading the records when Kennedy found out what DULES had been up to in 1958, he sort of said, "No wonder Indonesia doesn't like us, because look at what we've been trying to do. You know, we put in submarines and planes, and we had the 7th Fleet up there. We started a civil war. You know, of course they don't like what's happening. Obviously the CIA is involved, but it was never officially declared the CIA was involved."
Oh, by the way, did DULES ever personally visit Indonesia?
I don't think so. John Foster did.
I didn't see it in your book.
No, John Foster visited for I think, 24 hours once. And he had a flag was thrown on, but yeah, it was very brief. I think I compared the number of other countries and the hours spent travelling in other countries, other parts of the world with John Foster, and Indonesia, 24 hours, it hardly rated a mention, of course. But Alan was very careful, I think, not to go. I haven't found, he could have, but I haven't found any evidence that he went there. It's interesting, in 1928, I think, he was in court over an issue in Indonesia. He was already a budding young lawyer in Rockefeller Oil, and he was pitted against the great oil magnate Detering, who was in charge of Dutch oil at the time, clashed with Standard Oil, and young Alan Dulles won the case. So it's really, he started an interest, Alan had an interest in Indonesia very, very early. I meant to say before, his great-grandfather, I think, had also worked in the Dutch Netherlands East Indies 200 years before, and that's where you get the name Dulles, because their name used to be Douglas.
Douglas, okay.
But the G, as you know, in the Dutch G becomes very glottal, and Douglas becomes Dulles. And that's where you get the name from.
Yeah. So can you say it again? So Alan Dulles' great-great-grandfather came to
he was working, he was dealing in opium, and he was dealing in slaves. Opium and slaves.
Opium and slaves, wow.
Yes. And the slaves he used to take to America to work on the cotton, and eventually that's when he eventually stayed in America, and he changed his name because of that past history that he'd had. He decided to change from Douglas to the new name, Dulles. That's how he got the name back in American Revolution against the British. That's when he was arriving.
No, so
a long time ago.
Yeah, my question, Greg, if he had somehow, Alan Dulles had a link, ancestral link with someone who was in the Netherlands Indies, and he had so much at stake with regard to Indonesia, the regional rebellion, and West Papua and things like that. Why not visiting Indonesia in person?
Well, I think various reasons. I think he was being very, very careful. He was he's been described as the top British intelligence top man. Described Alan Dulles as the most remarkable intelligence agent that's ever lived.
Yeah.
And he's been very careful. He was trying to.
Kennedy called him a legend. Huh?
Yes. He was trying to get the Dutch out of Indonesia, out of the Netherlands East Indies. Even before World War II, he was trying to extricate them then. But when the World War II blew up and Franklin, FDR, American President FDR, requested Colonel Donovan and Alan Dulles to get America involved in the war, they used as you know, they stopped petroleum, they stopped oil for Japan, and that's why Japan attacked the East Indies. But that was all predicted, and it's exactly what Japan did. They had no real choice, really, because otherwise China would have gone over as far as Tokyo. The Americans were supplying 80% of Japanese oil and all the Chinese oil, so they're really in control of the conflict in Japan-China conflict before World War II. They were supplying oil to both parties. So stopping oil for Japan meant they would attack East Indies to get oil, and that was exactly what happened. But when Dulles was involved in that, it's interesting. He was like one of the top people in getting the Japanese, I suppose you could say, getting the Japanese to invade, to kick out the Dutch, because Standard Oil had been trying to do that for years. And at the end of the war, the Japanese, when they decided it was time to surrender, who was the first person they contacted Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles, no?
Was the first person, yes, in Switzerland, yeah. Which is really, people should ask why Alan Dulles, because he had such a link, already. It's a remarkable admission that he was the first person that they contacted.
Okay. Yes, Greg, let's stop here a little bit so I can explain something to my students. Ya, ini sangat menarik. Teman-teman dan juga para mahasiswa saya yang mungkin mengikuti acara ini ada dua tokoh yang menjadi sorotan dari bukunya Pak Greg ini, JFK dan Alan Dulles. Dan ternyata dari yang diterangkan Pak Greg tadi, memang ada paradigma atau pandangan yang berbeda, yang mungkin bahkan bertolak belakang antara Kennedy dengan Alan Dulles ini. Yang pertama adalah bahwa Kennedy itu pernah berkunjung ke Indonesia secara pribadi, waktu itu sebagai congressman atau senator dari Massachusetts. Was he a congressman or senator? Senator when he came here, JFK.
When he came to no, he was a senator later. He was a congressman, senator later. He was a congressman when he came early, I think.
I think he came here in 1954.
50s. Yeah, he was. 54, yes. If I'm not. I think he was senator later.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, yang jelas Kennedy pernah ke sini, sedangkan Alan Dulles tidak pernah ke sini. Itu perbedaan yang pertama. Perbedaan yang kedua, karena Kennedy pernah ke Indonesia dan ke beberapa negara Asia, dia tahu bahwa negara-negara Asia dan Afrika itu sangat menginginkan kemerdekaan bebas dari kolonialisme. Maka Kennedy ini sangat anti kolonial. Nah, sedangkan Dulles ini ya dia tidak ingin secara langsung mengatakan pro kolonialisme, tidak, tetapi dia ingin supaya meskipun sebuah negara itu sudah merdeka, tetap ada di bawah kontrolnya pihak Barat. Secara lebih spesifik, berada di bawah kontrol perusahaan-perusahaan pertambangan. Secara lebih spesifik lagi, itu perusahaan pertambangan yang didukung atau di mana Alan Dulles menjadi bagiannya, yaitu Rockefeller, dan itu perusahaan minyak. Jadi Dulles ini tampaknya bahkan sebelum Perang Dunia Kedua atau selama Perang Dunia Kedua juga, dia banyak berurusan dengan minyak. Waktu itu perangnya kan Jerman melawan sekutu, lalu Jepang juga melawan sekutu. Nah, Dulles ini mengusahakan supaya dia bisa suplai minyak kepada dua pihak. Saya kira dia juga mendukung penjualan minyak untuk Jerman, paling tidak untuk Vichy government di Prancis bersama Mohrenschildt kalau tidak salah, menurut bukunya Pak Greg ini. Jadi ya dia suplai minyak, jualan minyak kepada kedua pihak perang itu. Dan menurut Pak Greg menarik juga ya, silakan Anda menyimpulkan sendiri ya, bahwa ketika Jepang ini berhasil menduduki Jawa dan Indonesia, ya orang pertama yang ditemui siapa, ya Alan Dulles ini gitu. Jadi ini sangat menarik. Jadi Dulles itu secara pribadi fisik belum pernah ke Indonesia, tetapi dia banyak berurusan dengan sumber-sumber alam di Indonesia melalui perusahaan yang dia dukung itu. Ini sangat menarik. Dan menarik lagi bahwa mbah buyutnya Alan Dulles ini dulu pernah ke Hindia Belanda juga. Bisnisnya apa? Bisnisnya dua, yaitu opium dan budak, slaves ya. Nah, itu yang sangat menarik untuk dua orang ini. Dan ternyata menurut bukunya Pak Greg ini, dua tokoh yang berbeda ini akhirnya kontestasi dalam tanda kutip bertempur dalam kasus Indonesia tahun 60-an itu. Okay, probably we have only 2 minutes left. I don't know if we have questions from the YouTube chat. Vite, apakah ada pertanyaan yang dari YouTube chat? Kalau tidak ada,
Ada Romo, tadi
ada.
udah aku kirimkan ke WhatsApp Romo.
Oh, oke. Ya, ini ada pertanyaan dari Joanna PR, dari Maria Murtiati. Oh, you have a lot of people who are interested in your book, Pak Greg. Susana Sunarno, Elena Latif. Yang pertama, this is question for you, Pak Greg. Why Alan Dulles was so strong and influential? Yeah, I think you explained this in the book. Probably you can underline a few things. Okay, number 2 from Maria Murtiati. Why the Indonesian Army? Why AD? I thought it was Angkatan Darat. It was Alan Dulles. Why Alan Dulles was still allowed to be at the CIA office when he was already fired in 1963 in November? And then someone who was originally from Klaten, number 2. This is number 3. This is Susana. She was just happy that Klaten is being mentioned in this topic.
Yes.
Yeah. So
well,
and then the last one. This is a question in English from Elena Latif. How did the CIA or United States from the development of the conflict between Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China? This is the riff or the words that you have recommended. Okay, there's 3 questions, Pak Greg.
Right. Well, the first one, why Alan Dulles was so influential. I regard Alan Dulles as a child prodigy, really. He wrote a book when he was 8 years old on the Boer War.
Really?
Because his maternal grandfather was Secretary of State, and they had influential people meeting in the living room. As a 7-year-old, 8-year-old boy, he used to hide behind the curtain and take notes of what all the statesmen were saying, and that's how he wrote the book. I mean, he had intelligence just seeping around in his bloodstream from a very early age, I think. So he really was very bright and very sharp. And how he became influential, he was a top man. He got a job working in intelligence in the World War I because his uncle was Secretary of State. So he started off in intelligence, as I said before Kennedy was born. And he just thrived in it, During the 30s and 40s, he was a top man. In the 50s is really when we're talking about it. He was Director of Central Intelligence. But President Eisenhower was quite reluctant to appoint him because he knew he was prone to deviousness. And that's really why. He was the last person in the whole administration to be appointed. And whereas in the Kennedy administration, which was Democrat, he was the first person to be appointed. And I still think there was some sort of pressure on Kennedy to do that because Alan had helped him become president, you see, with the timely assistance with his briefing on Cuba. So time being the limit, why Alan Dulles continued in the CIA office in Washington, it was the official CIA office became Langley, Virginia, the big building we have now. That's the one Alan designed, but he simply kept up in the old office. They call it Foggy Bottom. It's a suburb in Washington, down by the river. And I mean, he met there with Kissinger and asked for Kissinger's help in the early 1951, I think it was, for Kissinger to help him get the position that he wanted, that was in the Eisenhower presidency, to be in charge of the CIA. With Kissinger's help, he managed to do that. Kissinger was in Harvard then, I think, and had a bit of a push. That he called in Kissinger to create he must have published something or written a few articles or something to get Kissinger's help to get the job that he wanted. But so that's why he was in a separate building. But he also had intelligence networks going back to the 1920s. For example, the man who was with Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of Kennedy, was befriended by a man called George de Mohrenschildt, a white Russian, and Alan Dulles had known George de Mohrenschildt since he was a 10-year-old boy. So that's the link, a very direct link between Alan Dulles and the Kennedy assassination. Well, the person alleged to have shot Kennedy was Lee Harvey Oswald. And here we are, de Mohrenschildt in the middle was a close associate. I mean, he was working together, de Mohrenschildt and Dulles working together before America joined in World War II. They were both selling oil to the Nazis. And links like that, which not many Americans have apparently, they haven't investigated deeply enough. The Warren Commission, they should have gone deeper in the Warren Commission. The third one about CIA, Sino-Soviet. Alan, since 1956, Alan was monitoring as Director of Central Intelligence. He was monitoring what seemed like a split developing between Moscow and Beijing. They kept very close monitoring on that. In the late 50s and early 60s, they decided it was real. It was an actual split. It wasn't a trick. But when Kennedy came into office in 1961, Alan knew it was genuine, but he did not inform President Kennedy that there was a split developing between Moscow and Beijing. What's more, Alan developed a policy he called it driving a wedge between Moscow and Beijing to increase that split, and he used politics in Indonesia, in particular PKI, as a means of exacerbating that split, making it worse. And Kennedy's approach to Indonesia was to pour in money, and it would have been a peaceful solution. Alan wanted the decimation of the PKI because of that, Moscow and Beijing started arguing amongst themselves. They started tank battles in 1969. Beijing was extremely worried that Moscow was going to put an atomic bomb on Beijing. That's why they brought in President Nixon and Kissinger to balance up the Cold War power. It became, the split was really obvious in 61, 62, but Dulles did not, getting obvious, Dulles did not inform Kennedy. And when Kennedy was proposing to go to Jakarta to befriend, to get his aid going again, he befriended Sukarno. Dulles was saying this trip to Jakarta has to be stopped because it's going to ruin this idea of splitting Moscow and Beijing. And that's the main motive for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think, agreeing to Alan Dulles' proposal to stop Kennedy's trip. So the Sino-Soviet split is really crucial for Kennedy, explaining what happened to Kennedy. It was a motive, and it was also explaining what happened in Indonesia in 65, 66. It's an important addition into the debate that's gone on in 65, 66 that needs to be included, put on the table to understand why there's a man and a woman in Klaten helping the killing. You know, what's going on? This is absolutely outrageous. What happened? Huh? And it's a shame, tragedy, undying tragedy, we'll say, that Kennedy's approach would have been a more peaceful approach. He was a far more peaceful president than his successor anyway, who upped the ante in Vietnam straight away. Kennedy was in the process of pulling out. LBJ strengthened the US presence, and thereby you get America's tragic war in Vietnam. Huh? Kennedy wanted to withdraw. Kennedy wanted to have a peaceful solution in Indonesia, and he was not permitted.
By Alan Dulles.
By Alan Dulles, yes.
Okay. I have there is another question, Pak Greg.
Right.
But actually, it's also my question. This is from Ineke. She is asking, according to Pak Greg, what is the long-term target of Alan Dulles with regard to the United States? Was he only kind of extension of some political or economic interest, or did he have his own motives to do all these big things. I mean, these disastrous things. What were his motives?
Well, his role in the Rockefeller empire really got him going in the 1920s. His brother, John Foster Dulles, married into the Rockefeller family.
Oh.
So he was part of it. And together, John Foster and Allen were the top lawyers in Sullivan and Cromwell, which was the legal firm, which was the front desk for Standard Oil. So he's a long time links with Standard Oil. Huh? But as an intelligence operative, yeah, he was nothing short of brilliant. So, but he didn't do these things to make millions, billions of dollars for himself. I think but he was never short. I mean, he's never asked for it. He never wanted anything, you know. Money was never an issue. He lived for intelligence, I think. And the people that actually benefited most were the Rockefeller oil empire. And the old man Rockefeller in the night, just before World War II, wrote a book saying, and we've done so well, and the Rockefeller empire has spread around the world, you know, and the man we should say thank you to most is here, you know. He's still working for us. He's in a cross between the State Department and private industry. So it's now been declared illegal, I suppose, to have your foot in both camps. But before World War II, Allen Dulles had a foot in the Rockefeller camp and a foot in the US government at the same time. And he was able to do amazing things.
Oh, okay. Thank you. A little correction from the audience. Sorry, Pak Greg, I said that Allen Dulles was fired in 1963. It was wrong. It was November 1961. Yeah, yes. Shortly after Kennedy became president. There is one more question. Yeah. Okay, there was just correction. Just one more question from Sugeng Agus Priyono. Agustin Sugeng Agus Priyono is a friend of mine, actually. He is asking about American companies that were in Indonesia or East Indies before independence, so that Allen Dulles. You said about Rockefeller that Allen Dulles wanted to defend that, to protect that too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. If you go back even a little bit before Allen became involved in the East Indies, like in World War I and after that, if you just go back a little bit further to the Aceh, the Dutch war in Aceh in the 1890s, it's interesting for those interested in history that you had American experts in artillery helping the Achenese fight against the Dutch. People aren't always aware of that either. That's remarkable. The American president had to intervene to get the American artillery experts out of Sumatra, where they were basically bombarding the Dutch, because it would have been bad for public relations, you see. But they were helping the Achenese fight against the Dutch colonial power then. When you move forward and look at Allen Dulles in the 20s, there were big tobacco companies in Sumatra as well, and that's really where you get the decision between Britain and the Netherlands to draw that line down Malacca Straits as a division for the Netherlands East Indies. Before that, northern Sumatra was a little bit amorphous and there was no set boundary. But once they'd done that, it was clear. The East Indies was defined as an entity, huge archipelago. But American interests, American companies there. The biggest, of course, was just before the World War II. Allen Dulles arranged for a company to be oil exploration in West New Guinea, Netherlands New Guinea, NNGPM, Netherlands New Guinea Petroleum Maatschappij. It became the company that found the gold in 1936, but it was a 60% American company, not Dutch. And that's another stroke of genius, I suppose, for Allen Dulles, because the Dutch really did not like American interference, and only reluctantly did they agree to 60% American control for a company in their territory in West New Guinea. But they gave in because produced evidence that the Japanese were landing indiscriminately on the coast of Netherlands New Guinea. It was wild coastline. It was only up to World War II. The Dutch controlled 5% only of territory was under colonial administration. So the Japanese were coming in anywhere and landing oil exploration equipment. So when Alan informed the Dutch about that, that's why they agreed to 60% American control for a company, you know. So it would help to keep it Dutch in a way, but it was a fatal mistake on the part of the Dutch because the Americans have never left it since. It was the Americans wanted the natural resources of the territory, the same as the Japanese were after natural resources. It was going to become New Guinea Island, which was, I think, 4 times the size of Japan, was going to become what they call New Japan. That's what the World War II expansion. Japanese Imperial Army expanded south to capture the island of New Guinea to make it New Japan. But and Indonesia and other countries were going to be like the market, but the natural resources of the territory was what they wanted. And they knew about the gold as well. They knew there was oil discovered 6 months before the Japanese invasion, the richest oil ever found in the world because it had no sulfur. And it's been the richness of the territory has been a problem ever since. So the presence of US companies has been growing in, well, never so much. Caltex found oil in Sumatra just before World War II, and the first people to parachute in after the Japanese surrender of World War II were Caltex officials to go and check up on their oil. Amazing. So very, very strong presence, very strong rationale for Dali's involvement in the archipelago.
Yes, thank you so much, Pak Greg. Thank you. The new thing, many new things that I learned from this explanation. Jadi teman-teman menjawab pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang muncul dari teman-teman tadi, dari Mas Sugeng, Mbak Maria dan teman-teman tadi, juga Ineke, ada 2 hal. Yang pertama, memang secara pribadi si Ellen Dulles ini punya kemampuan yang luar biasa. Usia 8 tahun sudah belajar menulis buku dan sebagainya. Ya memang punya kemampuan luar biasa. Tapi yang kedua, setelah dia dewasa dan sebagainya, dia sangat terlibat dengan bisnis besar, terutama bisnis oil. Dan banyak hal yang dilakukan sebenarnya adalah melindungi kepentingan perusahaan di mana Dulles itu menjadi bagiannya. Ya, menjadi bagiannya itu juga bisa berarti dia menjadi lawyer dari sebuah law firm namanya Sullivan. What's the name again? Sullivan.
Which one?
The name of the law firm that he.
Oh, Sullivan and Cromwell.
Sullivan and Cromwell. That was based in Europe, right?
Well, worldwide, but Alan Dulles was the top representative living in Paris in the 30s. Yes, okay. And that's where he met Prince Bernhard. Prince Bernhard.
Oh, Prince Bernhard.
Very close, very close.
Yeah. So I have a question about these things. But sekali lagi menunjukkan bahwa Dulles memang orang yang sangat capable, tetapi juga punya kaitan dengan perusahaan minyak yang besar pada waktu itu, yang tentu untungnya luar biasa kalau dunia itu terlibat di dalam perang, ya, terutama Perang Dunia Kedua, itu pasti butuh oil luar biasa untuk mesin perang. Tetapi yang juga menarik dikatakan Pak Greg tadi, dalam rangka menjawab pertanyaannya Mas Sugeng, adalah bahwa ternyata Jepang itu sudah tahu bahwa New Guinea waktu itu, ya, Papua ini, Pulau Papua itu kaya dengan sumber daya alam. Maka ketika melakukan serangan ke wilayah Hindia Belanda, sebenarnya ingin mengusir Hindia Belanda dan menguasai wilayah itu. Karena ada banyak tambang. Baik Jepang maupun Dulles itu tahu mengenai tambang itu. Well, Pak Greg, we are a little bit over time, but I have one little question. So the whole thing with Dulles in this case, he was not fighting. he was not really fighting for America,
No.
but he was fighting for his own interest and the interest of his group. Would that be true to say that?
I think you could say that. I mean, America and separating America from the multinational companies would be difficult, but it's his personal interest, that is, his links with Rockefeller, really predominated, I think. He even, I would say he used, or what do you say, pushed or designed the Cold War in his favour. And Fletcher Prouty brought this to my attention. If you remember a famous case when a U-2 plane was came down over Soviet Union in
19... powers, yeah.
Yes. And Fletcher Prouty was saying this couldn't have happened. Somebody fiddled with the plane to bring it down, and he's saying this was the last flight of a U-2. After that, you get spacecraft anyway, so it wasn't technology they were worried about. But because of that, the nuclear disarmament conference in Paris was cancelled, and Dulles did not want the nuclear that to go ahead, because he used the threat of nuclear attack in Cuba, and he used the threat of the same nuclear threat to get what he wanted in Southeast Asia, over the dispute with the Dutch and the Soviet help for Sukarno. That was all actually potentially a nuclear war, the same as Cuba. But nobody wants to describe it like that now. They just call it a sovereignty dispute. But they had nuclear power. That's what Kennedy said. He didn't want to be fighting over this territory in this western half of New Guinea, have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union over the western half of New Guinea. He said no, he doesn't want to do it. But there were big stakes, and Dulles' involvement in this was long term and very detailed. I mean, the weapons that came to help Sukarno mostly came from Moscow. Eventually, the 400 million big boost. Who supplied these weapons? Adam Malik was the was the Indonesian ambassador in Moscow at the time, and Adam Malik was what you call a CIA asset. So even though the world quaked when the Soviets became involved in this sovereignty dispute, it was Soviet planes and Soviet ships. It wasn't Soviet help for the Indonesian army. It was for the Navy and the Air Force. And the army eventually got control anyway of all those weapons. So it was a calculated risk. That's the other point I should like to make about Alan Dulles, is that he took risks. He was really a risk taker like that in intelligence terms, I mean. And I suppose we haven't heard about his failures, but his successes were notable, very notable. He used to say things like, language, as to say, it's what did he say? Likely, what did they say? It's more likely to be a success than not, I forget what the gambling term is now, but he would use that term to say, we'll go this way, not that way. But it was still a risk. He didn't know for sure. Everything wasn't in place, fixed. He was taking a risk quite often. And because of his preparation and his knowledge, he got what he wanted. He's very tricky.
Okay, yes, thank you, Pak. Again, thank you very much for all these new and interesting things that you have shared with us. Teman-teman, pembicaranya masih sangat menarik sebenarnya, tetapi kita sudah di ujung acara, waktunya sudah hampir habis. Beberapa hal yang mungkin bisa kita ingat dari apa yang dibicarakan oleh Pak Greg ini adalah bahwa Pak Greg Poulgrain ini melalui bukunya judulnya JFK versus Alan Dulles ini mengungkapkan banyak hal yang beliau temukan di dalam penelitiannya, entah ketemu langsung dengan orang-orang yang terlibat di dalam peristiwa pada waktu itu maupun melalui arsip di banyak negara dari Australia, Inggris, Amerika, Indonesia, dan sebagainya. Lalu beliau menemukan banyak hal, tetapi karena fokusnya adalah JFK dan DULES, dia menunjukkan bahwa DULES ini ternyata seorang pemain sekaligus risk taker yang luar biasa. Dia main di banyak negara, dalam kasus ini tentu Indonesia, tetapi sebenarnya dia main juga di banyak negara, di Kongo, mungkin di jelas di Kuba dan sebagainya. Tetapi beliau ini adalah seorang master Cold War warrior, istilahnya, yang sangat piawai memainkan ini. Tetapi yang menarik juga kita lihat bahwa ternyata sebagian besar dari perjuangan Allen Dulles, meskipun dia dekat dengan Presiden Kennedy, meskipun dia itu menjadi DCI, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, tetapi tampaknya yang lebih dia utamakan bukan kepentingan nasional, melainkan adalah kepentingan dia dan perusahaan yang dia dukung. Ini sesuatu yang baru bagi saya. Kadang-kadang kita melihat Amerika begini, Amerika begitu, Indonesia begini, begitu, Inggris begini, begitu. Ternyata kadang-kadang yang main adalah beberapa tokohnya. Dalam hal ini, tokoh kita pada hari ini adalah orang namanya Allen Dulles ini. Nah, harapannya dari saya, dari Pak Yapi, Bu Novi, Romo Susilo, Vite, Max, dan semua staf di Pusdema ini adalah bahwa entah kita setuju atau tidak setuju dengan hasil penemuan Pak Poulgrain ini, mari kita baca buku ini, kita simak buku ini, supaya kita memiliki pandangan yang lebih luas mengenai sejarah Indonesia, yang meskipun itu terjadi di masa lalu, tetapi tetap operasional sampai sekarang. Nah, siapa tahu dari pelajaran sejarah itu kita bisa merencanakan masa depan bangsa ini secara lebih baik. Supaya proklamasi kemerdekaan kita bukan hanya proklamasi kemerdekaan secara politis, tetapi juga secara ekonomi, sosial, kita juga menjadi bangsa yang semakin mandiri di bidang ekonomi, berdaulat di bidang politik, dan dalam kebudayaan kita juga berkepribadian. Thank you very much, Pak Greg. That was a great discussion. Thank you for all of you who are attending this live streaming, or those who are going to watch it as a recording and maybe some other forums too. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again in the next series of discussion by Pusdema. Salam sejarah, salam Pusdema. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.